Good hour of the day. Greetings in this case from Germany, from the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. My name is Suhail Al-Janabi. I am the co-manager of the initiative being supported by the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation of Germany, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Environment of Norway, by the Swiss Corporation, and being implemented by GIZ. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on governance issues that are related to the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in the future multilateral benefit sharing mechanism on digital sequence information. And while colleagues are still coming in, I would like to extend once again my welcome and of course point to the fact that this webinar will be held in English. However, we will have simultaneous interpretation into French and Spanish. You can see that that there are those buttons at the frame of the Zoom screen. So please use your language of choice, and we will also have a chat open. The chat, kindly only use it in English, and if you have then difficulties and challenges to express yourself in English, kindly use Google Translate, DeepL, or any other artificial intelligence interpretation. All right. We are having, as I said, this chat box. Please make sure that you use the option send to everyone, so that it's not going to specific persons, your contributions. And what we're trying to do is to pick up key elements out of the chat at the end of this 2-hour webinar to be answered and reflected upon by the panelists. We will, of course, not be able to address all points that are then reflected in the chat. That will surely inform future webinars and topics to consider. And I think the last one that goes without saying, that there's also some chat, and that in case there are comments that are offensive and disrespectful, that we will not answer them, and that this also may lead them to remove from the webinar, but we're not expecting this to happen. All right. Maybe a little bit about the substance and the setting. We know that coming from Montreal and the Kunming-Montreal framework, a couple of relevant decisions on digital sequence information and related benefit sharing within the multilateral system have been made. So there is, for example, language that says that the benefits from the use of digital sequence information should be shared fairly and equitably, and that those benefits should support conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. It stresses also the role of indigenous peoples and local communities. By the way, also something that was very often highlighted in the submissions by parties and stakeholders to the CBD on DSI, that pivotal role that indigenous peoples and local communities should play. So that was also one of the reasonings why we organizing again webinar that covers and addresses indigenous peoples and local communities in relation to digital sequence information. There are further references on a global multilateral mechanism for benefit sharing from the use of DSI, which should also include a global fund, and that modalities of this system will be drafted until COP16 in 2024. So on all these elements, now the clock is ticking. But we're not only having the issue of DSI related in at the CBD, but also in other international fora. At WIPO, there are as a standard on DSI in patent applications under discussion in UNCLOS, BBNJ. The agreement was just made on benefit sharing on marine genetic resources and DSI. So here it's covered and reflected. There are advanced negotiations at the level of the World Health Organization, the pandemic treaty on pathogens and genomic data on benefit and related benefit sharing. And finally, at the level of the FAO, the international treaty, and also the Commission, studies are ongoing. Proposals for the inclusion of digital sequence information in the standard material transfer agreement of the treaty are being discussed, and that there is further work to be undertaken on DSI until the 10th meeting of the governing body of the treaty. So it is a topic that is transversal in many different fora, and within the framework, the global biodiversity framework, we all know that it is enshrined in at two levels. At the level of the goal C, then in relation to benefit sharing based on genetic resources, digital sequence information, and TK. And of course, here also reference is made to indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as to traditional knowledge, which is associated with genetic resources. So one reason, of course, to reflect upon it in a webinar, as well as what we also see as language in Target 13, where also digital sequence information has been integrated alongside with genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, that measures have to be taken, legal, policy, and capacity building measures to ensure benefit sharing, including from digital sequence information and potentially traditional knowledge. And I think what is important is here the language that this should come alongside with facilitating appropriate access to genetic resources, and also facilitating a significant increase of the benefits shared, which means that this is an endeavor for parties and other stakeholders to create an enabling environment for that. So this is a little bit the background against we are holding that very webinar. And just to run you briefly through the agenda, we will have, after some welcoming remarks by the government of Norway, a reflection on why this webinar now, why is it timely, by Preston Hardison. We'll have a first panel being moderated by Timothy Hodges on governance-related questions, data governance, governance of the system, and also governance on the ground, with three panelists, Paul Oldham, Pierre Duplessis, and Terence Hay-AD. And then from a more practitioner's perspective, a sounding board, again moderated by Tim, with then contributions from Anne McCarthy, Chidi Wagaman, and Ronnie Dempers, more on who these persons are and what they are actually representing then in a minute. And of course, then we'll have a wrap up with a consideration of the chat before we then close. I would now ask Gaute Fogh-Hansen from the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment from Norway to say some framing, some welcoming remarks. Gaute, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Suhail. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, on behalf of the Norwegian government, I welcome you to this online global seminar on governance issues related to the role of IPLCs in the future DSI Multilateral Benefit Sharing Mechanism. DSI is an issue that cuts across sectors and instruments. In my view, only cooperation and coordination can bring us the desired results. The global DSI dialogue will continue its coordinated efforts to create knowledge on DSI, create trust, and discuss aspects of DSI on the road to COP16 in Turkey in October 2024 next year. I want to thank the ABS Capacity Development Initiative for offering its expertise and facilitation skills on this journey. COP15 in Montreal decided that DSI is an integral part of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The work on the further development of the multilateral mechanism established in Decision 15/9 on DSI is therefore about implementing the framework itself. The IPBS Global Assessment puts indigenous peoples and local communities squarely in the center of the conservation efforts, pointing out the crucial role indigenous peoples have as stewards of biodiversity. The new trust fund under GEF, the GEF, which COP15 requested the GEF to establish, follows up this connection as well. The annex in Decision 15/9 points to the future considerations of IPLC issues in the future development of the mechanism. Therefore, it's crucial to discuss how the mechanics of the mechanism and the fund will look like in relation to indigenous peoples and local communities. I am looking forward to your guidance on this. I wish us a fruitful seminar. Over to you, Suhail.
Well, thanks, Gaute, for these framing words. Let's see to what extent we can provide guidance. But before doing that, it is good tradition and a habit almost to see who is actually attending this this webinar. So if we could then briefly address this this poll on basically from which regions participants are attending, and also giving a little bit of a snapshot on the stakeholder group, so that we have an idea where we may then intensify our efforts to reach out. As it is now slowing down considerably, I think we can have a look at the results, so that we see that it is pretty much equally balanced. I mean, of course, maybe also due to the time zone, Western Europe and others is very well reflected. But of course, also we have Africa, we have Asia Pacific, Latin America, so all regions being there, and it is good to see that, of course, those that are responsible to further the system and to develop it, governments and government organizations, they make 50% of the participants. We have academia, private sector, and at least to some extent also indigenous organizations. And we will hope that the content of this very webinar can also then be more spread to that stakeholder group. Now, I would like to hand over to Tim Hodges from the McGill University Professor of Practice, and so that you can lead us further through this webinar and the different exchange rounds. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Sue-El. I've noted I will be moderating the two panel sessions. Will begin very shortly. Just to be clear with everyone, I am not only the moderator, but the timekeeper, and I've already noted that we're 5 minutes behind. So we will be exercising a certain amount of discipline on the panelists to keep to their allotted time, and I too will try and keep to my allotted time. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to welcome Preston Hardison to this webinar to launch us into what will be a very, I think, very interesting and thought-provoking discussion today with the panelists, and of course via the chat with all the registrants. I'm sure many of you do know Preston. He is a retired policy analyst who worked for the Tulalip tribes of Washington for 20 years. He is currently a pro bono policy advisor for Tutuba Foundation of the Philippines. He started following what is now known as the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, online during the PrepComs, the preparatory committee meetings, and he became an assistant to and negotiator for the IFB, as I well know, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, starting way back in 1996. He participated in the negotiation of the Nagoya Protocol and has worked on DSI since 2018. He also negotiated at the WIPO Intergovernmental Committee since the 1999 fact-finding mission, so some time ago. Preston, the floor is yours to lead us off and why we're having this webinar and why it is timely. Preston, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, the time is timely. We have a meeting coming up in November, an ad hoc working group on DSI. We need to provide inputs into that. So this is a very timely meeting to get organized. Goal C of Section G of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework includes the goal of the fair and equitable sharing of monetary and non-monetary benefits from digital sequence information on genetic resources, of course, as applicable. The related decision on digital sequence information on genetic resources is focused on setting up a benefit sharing mechanism. Preamble sets up general principles, including that distinctive practices for the use and distribution of digital sequence information on genetic resources requires distinctive benefit sharing solutions. The preamble recognizes that tracking and tracing of all DSI is not possible, but the use of all leaves the door open to exceptions. It further recognizes that the global multilateral biodiversity benefit sharing mechanism has the potential to effectively share benefits while meeting criteria set up in the decision C, paragraph 9, and also that exceptions to these may be identified. Solutions are to be compatible with decision C, para 9. These include effectiveness, efficiency, feasibility, practicability, more benefits than cost, legal certainty, consistency with open data access, supportiveness of research and innovation, and consistency with international legal obligations such as the Nagoya Protocol. IPLCs were targeted as the main beneficiaries of the mechanism during much of the negotiation. Paragraph 910 potentially diminishes this by creating an open-ended list of beneficiaries, although IPLCs are the only named beneficiaries. And as we heard in the opening statement, the IPBES recognizes that indigenous peoples and local communities are some of the main contributors to the conservation of biodiversity. The annex to the decision contains numerous issues that were not able to be negotiated. These include governance of the fund, triggers for benefit sharing, mechanisms for generating funds and dispersing them generically and then targeted to geographic regions or according to other unspecified criteria. Principles of data governance are also included for further consideration. The twin issues of the transfer of data from genetic resources covered under the Nagoya Protocol into digital sequences, and the governance of these sequences once they have entered into the databases, are at the core of open and responsible data governance. Fair and care principles are mentioned in the preamble as a potential source. Solutions will likely need to incorporate specific principles in targeted ways in order to reach an international consensus at the COP. Global principles do not rule out voluntary side agreements. It is unlikely that detailed and prescriptive principles will be consistent with the decision or pass consensus at next COP. However, there is support from some governments to develop some minimum standards or guidelines. The rapidly increasing concern over different forms of artificial intelligence, known as narrow AI, general AI, and super AI, suggests some forms of regulation is feasible, but these touch upon issues beyond the CBD. There are also substantive challenges in developing a strict governance regime for digital sequences that are widespread among all forms of life, and the problem that DSI issues do not fit the classical biopiracy model, as wild species and genes move and disperse on their own into and out of national and indigenous peoples and local community territories. The challenge from IPLCs is that, legal challenges aside, there is a lineal and spiritual relationship to genetic information derived from their genetic resources. The presenters here will offer their insights on how to address these distinct challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Preston. When we were planning this webinar, we went through a number of names, potential candidates to do what you've just done, and it was difficult, but it was obvious that you were the number one choice, and you've done a really very comprehensive and but brief overview of where we're at and the many issues and concerns and possibilities that lie ahead through the discussion today, but obviously going forward towards the next COP. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us so early from the west coast of the United States. I will introduce our first set of panelists. We're, as Sue has mentioned, we have two sets of panels discussions today. It's always difficult with very major time constraints to limit the recognition of those who are actually on the panels. And panelists spend a lot of time, as you well know, preparing for these discussions. And of course, they have a minimal amount of time to speak. So I'm very conscious of not allowing enough time to recognize their many accomplishments, both past and present. But let's move to the first panel. And I would ask that our three panelists for panel number one on governance to put their cameras on, please. So just make sure that's happening. Aha, very good. So you will see some familiar faces on the panel, but do let me spend just a little bit of time introducing our three panelists, beginning with Paul Oldham. Dr. Paul Oldham is an applied anthropologist who trained at LSE at the London School of Economics. As a young researcher, Paul lived and worked with the indigenous peoples in Amazon in southern Venezuela, and he used his PhD research grant to help establish the regional organization of indigenous peoples of Amazon, so ORPIA. Paul mentioned a few days ago that in fact that organization that he helped with his research grants helped to establish is about to celebrate its 30th anniversary this September. So a lasting investment, Paul. Paul has spent a decade as a researcher with the ESRC in the UK, Center for Economic and Social Aspects of Genomics, where he started to examine the implications of genomics for what became the Nagoya Protocol. More recently, and I think many of you will know, he's led 2 independent studies on DSI for the European Commission. The second of these studies, called Sharing Digital Sequence Information, DSI, came out shortly before COP15 and well, underlined the need to focus on data governance and on models for sharing DSI. Paul is currently the director of One World Analytics and a senior honorary fellow at the Manchester Business School. Well, welcome, Paul. Next, I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Pierre Duplessis. Mr. Duplessis is equally well known. For more than 20 years ago, Pierre was working with the Namibian indigenous peoples and local communities to develop sustainable economic opportunities based on their biodiversity when he got involved in ABS. And he hasn't looked back. He's negotiated on behalf of Namibia and Africa during ABS and DSI discussions, not only at the CBD, but FAO and as well as WIPO, and is currently a member of the Namibian delegation participating in the World Health Organization, WHO, pandemic treaty negotiations. Thanks, Pierre, for being with us today. And last but not least, our third panelist for this first round is Terence Hay-Adi. Dr. Hay-Adi currently manages the Global ICCA Support Initiative, GSI, funded by the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, which is delivered by the UNDP implemented GEF Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program, as you know, the SGP. From 2003 through 2022, Terence has served the SGP in a number of different capacities, providing small grants to civil society organizations, NGOs, and indigenous peoples in partnership with many international development agencies, including, as a matter of fact, with the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. Terence holds a BA in Human Sciences and a Master's in Environmental Change and Management from Oxford. For his PhD at University of Cambridge in the field of social anthropology, he conducted institutional ethnography of the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, analyzing the power dynamics between local and global actors in protected areas in indigenous territories. I must say, Terence, that sounds like a very interesting piece of work, and I think I'm going to try and track it down at my university at McGill. So welcome, Terence, and again, warm welcome to all of our 3 panelists. In the context of indigenous peoples and local communities, the DSI nexus, as I refer to it at least, we've asked Paul to reflect on the theme of data governance, and we've asked Pierre to reflect on the theme of the governments of the MLS, the multilateral system, and Terence to reflect on indigenous peoples and local communities and governance on the ground. And just to be clear, by on the ground, that phrase simply means in practice. So it's not, and Terence's remarks, of course, will not be limited to the local context, but indeed will include the national and international contexts, I am sure. We've asked the 3 panelists to provide their reflections on their particular themes on the current and what the landscape looks like in terms of the issue they're focusing on, some of the main points of consideration and expectations, and most importantly, and I think it's mentioned by Gauta in his opening remarks, we're looking for their guidance. We're looking for improving our understanding, and we're looking for some ideas, some options, and some advice on making progress in this area. Each of the panelists have 8 minutes maximum. Paul, will start with you, and then Pierre will follow you, and then finally Terence. Paul, you have the floor. 8 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So one of the important features of the COP15 decision on DSI is a reference to principles for data governance in the annex, and in the recently concluded BBNJ treaty, we get a reference to what is called open and responsible data governance at various points, where open means data that can be shared openly. Responsible means that those involved in data sharing have responsibilities to each other. And governance means that there is a transparent governance framework in which those involved in data sharing can participate in decision making about governance. So I'm going to talk about this in kind of quite general terms and link through, I think, to what Anne will be talking about later. So I wanted to start by being rather provocative. I think that in the existing discussions, there's been an assumption that there is some form of agreed international settlement on data sharing and governance for DSI. We see this, for example, in references to current international practice in COP decisions and in the BBNJ treaty text, but in my view, no such settlement exists. Perhaps what governments and indigenous peoples are actually after is the creation of a flexible framework for such an agreed settlement, rather than assuming that one exists, and an agreed settlement that could exist over the longer term. So what we have at present are two kind of main models for data sharing for DSI, with the third represented actually by the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and I'll perhaps come back to that. So the first model involves the treatment of DSI as a de facto part of the public domain, or as a kind of free-for-all model. You can do what you like. So the model has its origins in the Human Genome Project and is embodied in the policies and practices of the INSDC. So this model is attractive for researchers, it's attractive for industry, it's pretty frictionless, there are no responsibilities or obligations to providers, and this has real strengths as a system. But I think it's reasonable to say, if provocative, that the INSDC government is in reality opaque, and it's unclear why developing countries or indigenous peoples and local communities would want to share their resources or data through such a system. What is the benefit of this to them is the obvious question, and there is no obvious answer. The second model for data sharing can be called a closed commons and is represented by GISAID. Now, GISAID emerged in response to the perceived inadequacies of the INSDC data sharing model, notably with respect to recognition of researchers and benefit sharing. GISAID users are required to comply with terms and conditions that recognize contributions and make best efforts for collaboration between users and providers. And this model has proved to be extremely popular with researchers, notably during the pandemic, where GISAID became the most popular repository for depositing COVID sequence data. But GISAID has recently been plunged into crisis by allegations that emerged in Science magazine in May and in other areas of the scientific press, that its governance is lacking in transparency, it's arbitrary, and it's capricious. Right? So this brings us to these issues of the relationship between openness and responsibility and governance. So in the COP decisions on DSI and in the BBNJ treaty, we see this considerable emphasis on the desirability of openness in sharing DSI. On the other hand, I think there's growing recognition of the importance of responsibility. So the concept of open and responsible data governance, or as it was called, actually came out of a discussion at COP15 between the IAFB and a group of young researchers known as the Interdisciplinary Digital Sequence Information Group, IDSI, which is a cute acronym. And what we were discussing when we came up with this concept was the wider principles and frameworks for sharing DSI that might form part of a future solution. And you see this in the COP decision, in the reference to the fair and the care principles, the UNESCO recommendation on open science, and the OECD recommendation on enhancing access to and sharing of data. And that's what I'm going to talk about now before closing. So the aim of the 2021 OECD recommendation on enhancing access to and sharing of data is to set out general principles and policy guidance on how governments can maximize the benefits of enhancing data access and sharing while protecting and respecting the rights of those involved. So it has there are three pillars to the recommendation. One is reinforcing trust across the data ecosystem. The second is stimulating investment, incentivizing data access and sharing, and finally effective and responsible data access and sharing across society. So those of us who've been hanging around with access and benefit sharing for quite a long time will recognize that trust is a fundamental issue, and the conditions for the creation of trust are a fundamental issue in ABS and digital sequence information. So why the elements of the OECD recommendation are important, I think, is because they provide a framework for navigating the middle ground in these debates. On the one hand, we have the danger that the sharing of genetic resources and digital sequence information will be closed down by concerns about biopiracy, misappropriation, exploitation. We have the risk of a giant bureaucracy involving tracking and tracing molecules from their origin into products. And on the other hand, we have this approach of a kind of free-for-all, anything goes, without respect for responsibility or equity. So the OECD recommendation emphasizes that data access, that there needs to be data access agreements that ensure that data are as open as possible to maximize their benefits and as closed as necessary to protect legitimate public and private interests. And I think that is actually the space that we're trying to navigate in connection with the rights of indigenous peoples, the rights of different parties to this. And in closing, I think we've seen an important kind of step forward in the case of the BBNJ treaty, which actually builds on the decision from COP15 and in fact on the OECD recommendation, in that the BBNJ treaty, the key to the agreement on genetic resources and digital sequence information was two things. One was recognizing that existing scientific practices, such as the use of what's now called a BBNJ standardized identifier and data management plans, which of course nobody had ever heard of, represented technical keys that actually unlocked the legal agreement in terms of the creation of conditions of trust for the BBNJ agreement. And I think as Anne is going to be talking about kind of practical initiatives that are grounded in existing scientific practices that are then used to find ways forward to secure greater recognition and respect for the rights of indigenous peoples. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm going to limit my comments and move quickly to Pierre, but I can't help myself but note that, and it's something that I do go on about. I must confess the continuing lack of trust in the CBD itself has been less than helpful in moving forward in a good number of policy areas under the CBD, and I think it's most interesting that in fact it's through our discussions today that we're highlighting the need for trust, whether it's been there before or not. We've got to find a way to do that. I can't underline the importance of that. Can't exaggerate it at all. So Pierre, over to you, and my apologies for intervening.
Thank you, Tim, and good time of day to everyone. So I've been asked to talk about the considerations around IPLC involvement in the DSI multilateral, in the governance of the DSI multilateral mechanism. And I want to start by saying that anyone who's been to CBD meeting would almost surely have heard calls for full and effective participation of IPLCs in issues that affect them directly. And you know, in more generally, there's an understanding in indigenous circles about nothing about us without us. So I think it's a long-standing call for recognition and involvement, and it came home very clearly to me in Nagoya when we agreed on Article 10 on the multilateral benefit sharing mechanism, where the first thing that happened after that was being approached by indigenous representatives that were saying, so what exactly are you proposing in terms of indigenous knowledge, we're going to share this on a global basis, and then everyone else will get the benefits, or how is that going to work? So I think we've moved on to that. I think that there is now a recognition of the demand from IPLCs for full and effective participation. But what exactly should this role be in a multilateral mechanism? I think going with that, there's also now widespread, if not quite universal yet, recognition that IPLC should be the primary, or at least the major beneficiaries of the multilateral mechanism. And then there's an interesting question about this. I mean, on the one hand, that's because they are recognized as the most effective stewards of biodiversity, but also, of course, they are owners of biodiversity that occurs in their territories, and they are rights holders over associated traditional knowledge. So which of these roles, being the most effective biodiversity stewards or being owners and rights holders, should be prioritized in their governance role, I think is something that we can usefully unpack a bit as we further these discussions. It doesn't make a difference which of those roles underlies their participation in the governance system. Well, I suppose it depends on a certain extent on what we answer to some of the questions that Paul posed. To what extent will there be day-to-day decisions made about access to data, for example, or will it be a simple self-operating open system? So and then again, when it comes to the distribution of the benefits, are those benefits for the people who hold the traditional knowledge or have the resources under their management, or should the distribution be designed so as to maximize the conservation and sustainable use impact of the funding? So thinking along those lines, I think one can characterize the potential involvement of IPLCs in the multilateral mechanism at two different levels. They are not, it's not an exhaustive list, and they're not mutually exclusive, but so two broad levels. One of them is an initial in the design phase and potentially ongoing role in developing the norms and criteria for the mechanism. And the aim of that would be to ensure that indigenous values are taken into account in the design of the mechanism, and then also kept prominent in its evolution and adaptation as we learn lessons from implementation and presumably improve our practices in line with the, the underlying architecture of the global biodiversity framework as a learn, replan, redo, improve framework. So there's that role in the norms and criteria and value setting. But then there's also potentially a much more practical day-to-day management role, if you want. For example, an ongoing rotating representation of IPLCs on the board or some other decision-making body, with an active role collectively, of course, with other stakeholders in making decisions about how to mobilize resources for the mechanism and distribute those resources to look after biodiversity. So to summarize that, I think there's a question around full and effective, or advisory, or maybe both. Then some of the issues I think one should be thinking about taking this forward. One very practical one, the GEF Council has just agreed to create this Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. Could the GEF's rules and procedures limit IPLC involvement in governance? And if so, how could this be addressed during the ongoing DSI negotiations? Is it an issue that should be on the table when we next discuss what, how to flesh out what we agreed in Montreal? Very practically, again, how would such representatives be chosen? By whom would they be chosen? Would there be a need for regional balance? Is there an issue around the relatively different rights and privileges and, you say, international recognition of indigenous peoples, and on the one hand, and local communities on the other? Is this an issue that will affect the governance of the mechanism? Is there possibly a role in that for the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to consider the management and the governance of the mechanism? Also very practically, and this may be even more of an internal issues for IPLCs than it is one for the bigger community, but still, how do we avoid potential perceptions of conflicts of interest in decision making about resource allocation? If, for example, one can think about if it's a rotational representation, that in a particular funding cycle, there will be no rewards, no grants made to groups who have representatives on the decision-making board in that particular funding cycle. And then there's a wider question, right? Would a few IPLC representatives really ensure that resources are channeled to where they are most needed for conservation and sustainable use? And how would this funding be channeled to ecosystem restoration activities which might need to take place outside the territories of indigenous peoples, and hopefully with the involvement of local communities, but quite often would involve a much more central role for the state and other stakeholders? And then in relation to those considerations, what is the role for science? You know, for example, if you look at the African proposal on the multilateral mechanism, we proposed that the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services would set priorities. So what is the interaction between science and indigenous wisdom in that regard? And then at a more sort of on the ground level, is there an argument that can be made for subsidiary institutions at regional or local level, regional, national, or local, to think in a connected way, in a relational way, applying indigenous worldviews to the situation and making ecosystem level decisions at a much more local level? And then if you think about it like that, if you think about the real value of indigenous knowledge and indigenous ecological wisdom being at that local level, where the people who live there with the biodiversity and have done so for millennia have an exquisitely detailed understanding of the sustainable management of that biodiversity, is that not maybe where the impact of indigenous involvement, full and effective or advisory would really make a difference? Is at that local level where people really know what goes for what in the management of local biodiversity? Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Pierre. Your last point really resonates with me, because I've in my current position at McGill, I've been pondering, with not many answers yet, but pondering how the international community, how the multilateral system can affect something that's more virtuous and more more of a learning model than it has in the past, and linking local experience with international policy and vice versa. It's been top down, as you well know. But I think we've entered a new era, particularly with the decisions at a COP15 that recognizes, of course, indigenous peoples and local communities with their role in conservation. But I think it's clear that it's pointing to the need for something more innovative. And I do absolutely think it's possible for the international system and national systems to adjust to the needs of the international community and local communities. So thank you very much, Pierre. And now to Terence, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tim and Suhail, for the kind invitation. So picking up on where Pierre left off about the GEF. So 30 years ago in Rio, it's worth recollecting that there was a very strong push from indigenous peoples and CSOs to have access to the GEF. And now looking back after 30 years, the growth of the small grants program provides a lot of lessons, both in terms of the governance and in terms of access to finance. So roughly speaking, the small grants program reflects about 4% of the GEF replenishment. Depends slightly how you would define it. And we saw last week with the establishment of the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, an aspirational target of reaching about 20%. So I'll just share a few thoughts and reflections around the governance. So one of the key lessons of the SGP has been about decentralizing governance to the national level. And I see that there are a lot of governments on this webinar. And whilst the funding actually flows to CSOs and IPs and LCs, there's a shared governance where governments share the decision-making about the approval of grants at the national level. And the points Pierre was talking about in terms of working with customary governance institutions at the local level is taken into account in terms of the national level grant making strategies. So the SGP has now grown to about 132 countries, about 28,000 small grants, and about $1 billion have flowed. And in that time, there's been a lot of experimentation in terms of some of the ways in which we can use local languages, vernacular languages, oral proposals, involvement of indigenous peoples fellows in terms of the monitoring of projects. And so I'll just put in the chat that there's a publication which summarizes some of these operational lessons from that period. But one of the other questions I was asked to address was in terms of the access to finance, the relationship between NGOs and intermediaries and groups on the ground. So what we see is a type of ecosystem with a dash, not where there is a balance of some NGOs at the national level with a certain level of capacity that may understand DSI or the Nagoya Protocol, accessing resources, and then grants flowing to indigenous peoples who've never had basically opening a bank account to have their first project. And over time, there's been an effort and a progressive increase of the direct access for indigenous peoples. There are some disparities in terms of the regions, and I have a presentation which I think can be made available afterwards of some of those figures in terms of the growth of the access directly for different groups. So I think I'll probably just stop there and to say that and lastly to say that with the Jeff Assembly coming up next month in August, quite a lot of thought will go into some of the events around how to respond to this current debate around the DSI with the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. And thank you very much, Tim, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Terence. I noted your experience over the years, and it's going to be even more pertinent and needed as we go forward, learning through experience and then innovating. And I believe those meetings you alluded to, Jeff meetings, will be held in Vancouver, if I'm not mistaken, in August. And of course, perhaps coincidentally, if one believes in coincidence, Vancouver and British Columbia, very, very important and active region of Canada for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And undoubtedly awareness there will help fuel interest and awareness and innovation, I trust. Right. So again, many thanks, Paul, Pierre, and Terence for leading off this first panel. I think it's been fascinating, and I'm taking note of the many questions that were raised and a number of issues that were raised without necessarily you providing us with the answers. And that's, of course, deliberate. I know you do have answers. You, I think, took the right approach and just raised the questions, and we'll all have to find the answers together over time, and perhaps maybe even in the second panel. So we now move to the second panel, and I will begin the second panel by, of course, introducing our esteemed panelists. Before I do that, I just want to ensure that we have all the panelists here. And right. It may be that we have one of our panelists has been unable to join us yet, but let's move forward, and with the hope that that he will be able to join us as soon as possible. So in alphabetical order, I'd like to introduce our first panelist, and our first panelist is Anne McCartney. Dr. McCartney completed her PhD in computational genomics and evolution in Dublin City University. I do want to ensure that all our panelists' cameras are on. Just saying. So we can put a face to a name. After this, Anne, for her first postdoctoral research position, she worked on creating a Mauturanga Maori aligned genomics infrastructure for the sequencing of culturally salient flora and fauna of Aotearoa, so New Zealand. From here, she transitioned to the National Institutes of Health, NIH, where as part of the genomics informatics section became part of the team that published the first complete human genome. During this time, she worked in the NIH Office of Data Sharing and Management, where her work focused on responsible tribal data management and sharing, and also directs the scientific program for Wise Ancestors, as well as the European Reference Genome Atlas pilot. Finally, Anne has many publications written in partnership with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. Welcome, Anne. I understand that you just arrived in Dunedin, South Island of New Zealand, after a long Trans-Pacific flight, so we very much appreciate you joining us as we do the other panelists. It's awfully late for you, so again, many thanks for joining us. Next, I do hope he has been able to join us. I have the pleasure of introducing Chidi Ogwanaman. And Chidi is, Dr. Chidi Ogwanaman holds the Professorial Research Chair in Sustainable Bioinnovation, Indigenous Knowledge Systems, and Global Knowledge Governance at the University of Ottawa, where he's affiliated with 3 centers of excellence. Chidi is the founder and co-founder of Access and Benefit Sharing Canada, ABS Canada, and the Open African Innovation Research Network, OpenAIR, respectively. Chidi has a track record of working with many Indigenous peoples and local communities, not only in Canada, but in Africa and the Global South. He is part of the African Group Negotiating Think Tank, actively involved in the Waipo Traditional Knowledge and Traditional Cultural Expressions group. And in fact, I think he's just arriving in Geneva this morning or this afternoon. And he does note that in his message to me that finally, in my words at least, finally, WIPO is finally at the verge of a diplomatic conference on intellectual property and genetic resources. Now, last but not least, I have the pleasure of introducing Ronnie Dempers. So Ronnie is the executive director of one of Namibia's leading sustainable community development organizations, the Namibian Development Trust, NDT, which promotes environmental stewardship, resource conservation, and ecosystem-based livelihood generation. Ronnie's work also involves providing leadership on institutional governance aspects of community-based organizations, where he's also the chairperson of NACSO. I think that's in Windhoek, a consortium of NGOs involving the University of Namibia, which provides support to myriad community organizations practicing community-based natural resources management in that country. So once again, a warm welcome to our panelists. We're obviously very pleased that you were able to join us from as far as Southern Africa, as I noticed, South Island, New Zealand, and of course, Chidi, who we do trust has made it to Geneva. In organizing this webinar, we used the term, we described it as the sounding board panel, just sort of to characterize it and to shape it. And that simply means we were looking to you, our panelists, for some reactions to what you've heard from the first set of speakers. They raised a number of questions and a number of issues, as you well heard, on data governance, on the ground governance, and of course, the governance of the MLS. But by no means do we want to restrict you to reactions to those to the remarks of the first panel. You will be given the floor to range as widely as you might want to. If it's pertinent to you, then it's of course pertinent to us. So we'll begin. We'll have 2 rounds. The first round. Sorry, just to remind everybody that the chat function remains there to pose specific questions and comments. And of course, as Sue mentioned at the front end of this webinar, we will be directing questions to the panelists that or observations that are raised in the chat. So please do feel free. You're encouraged to use the chat. So let's start with our panelists by hearing their reactions to what they heard from the earlier panelists. And we encourage you not to be shy. Is there something missing? Do you disagree or agree with what was said? Would you change the emphasis that was placed by the first set of panelists? Now, obviously, this is not a debate between panelists, But again, I do urge you to be frank, and I know you will be constructive, but please do be open. That will benefit everyone. So you're limited, unfortunately, to 5 minutes each for this first round, and we may expand it if Chidi is unable to join us. So please, let's start with Anne, followed by Chidi, we hope, and certainly by Ronnie. You have 5 minutes each, and maybe a little bit more. So let's start with Anne. Anne.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to Suhail and the organizers for the invitation to join today. I'll jump straight in because I just have 5 minutes. So one particular point that I thought that I would like to thank both Paul and Preston for was making visible the why. So when conversing about biodiversity DSI, it's so important to keep in our minds why we are having this candid dialogue surrounding data governance and what that means to Indigenous peoples and local communities. We must first look back in order to look forward. It is not new news that there is a history of colonial, unjust, and inequitable practices associated to the collection of species for the purposes of scientific research and biodiversity conservation, including research that produces DSI. These practices have and continue to disproportionately negatively impact IPLCs worldwide, who are the stewards of over 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, but have yet to receive their fair share of benefits from its access and use. As a result of this, there is a rightful distrust amongst many IPLCs concerning the extraction of samples and data from within their lands. Only through a mutual understanding of these facts and a commitment to developing and building the necessary trust with IPLCs can we together safely and cautiously navigate the middle ground to sustainably save the Earth's biodiversity. We can only proceed at the speed of trust. One issue that I did want to add to was the topic of open versus conditioned DSI access, which tends to dominate the narrative in this space. When the concept of Indigenous data governance is brought to the table, it too often is presented as Western scientific researchers being pro-open access versus IPLCs being pro-conditioned access. And this too often gets conflated with IPLCs being anti-science or anti-progress, which is certainly very far from the truth, as IPLCs have been scientists since time immemorial and are not anti-science, but rather are anti-extraction, anti-exploitation, and anti-misappropriation. By pitching access systems against each other in this way, it's not constructive, it stagnates discussions and results in stalemates. It's also important to position the conditioned data access and use dialogue in a more broad context, as we all know that it is a shared concern across many other DSI interested parties, particularly those with commercial interests. I will also just add a final quick personal perspective as part of the biodiversity DSI research community. As a community, we are in the midst of a transformative change. We are scaling, standardizing, coordinating, communicating and collaborating across institutions, countries, and continents. We are now a global enterprise of biodiversity DSI producers. With this in mind, we have a huge responsibility. Our mission is to construct a gold standard planetary DSI database for all of the Earth's known species. But we also have an accountability to the next generation of researchers coming behind us who will access and use this data into perpetuity. Entering the global stage brings many cultural, ethical, political, and legal challenges, and the technical science cannot and should not proceed outside of these challenges if we are to succeed in a fair, equitable, and just manner. On the technical side, as a community, we are creating standard of practices that researchers look toward to guide scientific excellence when contributing to this planetary DSI database. During this time of globalization and standard setting, more and more IPLCs are becoming trained in data science. Programs like SING, the Summer Internship for Indigenous Genomics, and Indigidata are equipping IPLCs worldwide with the necessary skills to partake in the two-eyed seeing necessary to innovate novel ways to operationalize Indigenous data governance in a way that can be interoperable with standard DSI practices and with very minimal disruption to the infrastructures and systems already in place. But this is only possible when IPLCs are considered as co-equal collaborators in the DSI innovation process and not seen as passive receptors of information. One example of indigenous-driven data governance Indigenous data governance innovation are the CARE principles of Indigenous data governance, which commonly sit alongside the FAIR principles as exemplars of what good data governance is and how to do it. They are a set of 4 broad principles that can be used as the Rosetta Stone in terms of Indigenous data governance. The CARE principles are intentionally people-centric and were developed to act in complement to the FAIR principles, which are more data-centric. They are fast becoming adopted by the research community, and you will see them heavily cited in publications as well as a plethora of DSI policies. I will close my remarks by stating that the DSI enterprise and its systems and structures have a journey to embark toward developing and building trust with IPLCs. But proceeding with accountability, transparency, and trust is the only way to ensure that we do not recapitulate past missteps and rather learn from them as we traverse the path toward building an equitable, multilateral solution for the sharing of benefits from DSI that is responsive to the needs of IPLCs. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much, Anne. Again, underlining trust, and in my limited experience, it's not just a question of including all the players involved in a policy area to come up with a policy or response, and not necessarily a legal one. But it's also about process and as well as mechanics, and there's the right way to do it and the less than right way to do it. And I think you've noted some of the ways that it can be done, already proved. And so there are things to build on. We're not starting from scratch and from a blank whiteboard. Ronnie, could we turn to you, please, and invite you to share with us your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim, and all the panelists and all that are part of this. It's really a great opportunity for me to join you from Namibia, and also to be able to share a little bit about our experience from here and how that all fits within that, and some thoughts about, based on our lessons learned, how we can move forward and influence agenda that I believe has been missing quite a lot corners in terms of ensuring that resources and interventions can generate results that are needed. It is, I think, good to put it in context that I'm part of a Namibian community-based natural resource management program that has been built over years. And one of the key lessons for us is coordination and broad stakeholder involvement. Although that takes quite a long time, it's built around the African proverb that says that you may go far if you go up. I mean, you can go far if you go. It may take quite a long time for you to be able to build, but we have seen the benefits of being able to invest into a process that ensures government, communities, the private sector, the traditional authorities being able to work together. And that is, I think, one of the lessons that we have learned from the Namibian CBNR program, and of course also including the private sector. And I think it is that joint partnership, notwithstanding that there are shortcomings even in this coordination, and there's always an effort to be able to strengthen. But I think that has been a key thing. We have reached success, and some important lessons have been learned. But what we are recognizing, and maybe that is important for the conversation that we are having this afternoon, is the need for strengthening community voice in all that we are doing. That communities must be representing themselves. And I would like to echo what Pierre has said. You know, this is a very strong slogan from Namibia, that communities have realized that nothing about us without us. I mean, we need to be part of the engagement process. And the Namibian CBNRM program has recently seen, I mean, I've been part of a process the past 2 weeks, where for the first time conservancies, because we have got about 86 conservancies that have got regional structures. They have come together to realize the need for community voices to be heard on issues that affects them. Many a times it has been NGOs that have been representing them, but communities have now decided to form their own national association. And I believe that it is that kind of a national body that will be able to participate at national platforms, at international platforms, and engage in this kind of data governance issues that we are discussing, the benefit sharing frameworks. And through strengthening of those mechanisms, I think we'll be ensuring that community voices are not only heard, but that these frameworks that are developed at global level be able to cascade in a manner that will benefit communities on the ground and where the resources matter the most. What I'd also like to share with you is some of the funding mechanisms. And I heard my fellow panelists also reflecting about the UNDP Small Grants Program. The organization that I'm part of has participated with the UNDP Small Grants, and I think that in a manner that we have implemented it in Namibia represents a model that we can use and scale it up for future interventions. Why I'm talking about this model is having some elements of success. It was because communities were at the center of the whole process in terms of determining their needs, in terms of determining what they want and how they want it. We as a NGO that is supporting the communities were part of the engagement. UNDP, through the JEF funding that was mobilized, was able to provide the support, and there was a tripartite agreement. And it was a mechanism that was different from the usual way that we were doing the funding and support, because NDT was, for example, contracted to provide M&E support to these communities and also a capacity building, because that is one of the missing links that I believe has been not enjoying attention throughout the whole supporting mechanisms. There has been underinvestment in building capacity at community level. Naturally, community-based organizations are not set up to be able to deal with different funding requirements and funding mechanisms. Community-based organizations are set up to more exercise what I would call downward accountability, to be able to engage with their members. And therefore, I believe that any funding mechanism should be able to be structured in a way that strengthens community organizations' ability to be able to best practice and implement the downward accountability. But we have seen, unfortunately, some of the models that have been premised around maybe that was not the intention, but sort of forcing communities to be more engaged into upward accountability mechanisms where a lot of emphasis are put on how to meet the donor requirements, etc., etc. And, you know, naturally, as I have said, community-based organizations are not set up to be able to serve as vehicles that will receive and be able to manage this funding successfully. But we have seen that where different partners are involved and where capacity building is an integral part of such an intervention, success and the investments can be secured. But I'd also like to add that apart from the conservancies, which is one of the examples that we're using as a local community-based organizations, also similarly, indigenous communities in Namibia have come together and have decided to strengthen their indigenous national association, which for me means that there is a trend that I'm observing that communities, even the indigenous communities, are realizing the need to be able to influence those decisions that matters most to them. And I believe that their voices needs to be heard around these important interventions. Therefore, one of my recommendations is that future interventions needs to build in capacity building as an integral part to be able to strengthen the ability of these national associations to be able to have the necessary information, to be able to advance their agendas. Also, I need to just caution that when we talk about community-based organizations, we should not just romanticize community-based organizations. They are also not homogeneous structures. They are also engulfed and involved into local dynamics, local politics, and that they have to manage. And therefore, we need to be engaging at that level to ensure that local communities are not hijacked. Local community organizations are not hijacked to be able to serve the interests of the elite. And how we engage to work with the local elite is also an important intervention, because by working with them successfully, because they are needed, that's part of the capacity that is in the local communities. But through that, we'll be able to ensure that resources and whatever investments that are made at community level will be able to go down and benefit communities on the ground. So I think what I'm sensing in Namibia is that the need for strengthening of voices, the need for a flexible funding mechanisms that are responsive to the needs of the community on the ground. I cannot overemphasize the need for capacity building. And as some of the panelists have emphasized, the question of trust, I think is important. And it's through this supporting these joint coordination mechanisms, joint mechanisms where different partners and different stakeholders work together, that will be able to achieve the intentions that we are creating this initiatives for. So let me pause there for now.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. There's some emerging themes, and you made it clear, as did Anne, that we do have experience. We have learned, some of us have learned from experience on the ground, and it's available to use and to further learn from and to apply. So thank you for that. My experience is largely in multilateral affairs, and it's always it drives me nuts, drives me crazy, the lack of ability to start with experience, start with what's actually happened and what actually works before deciding on what a solution is or how to move forward. But I think in the case of DSI and in indigenous peoples and local communities, at this nexus, it is in fact possible to do just that. So thanks again, Anne and Ronnie. And I see that we have our third panelist who has joined us. Welcome, Chidi. I've asked that we're on our first round of this panel, and so you've got 5 minutes to provide us with some initial remarks. It's good of you to join us, and welcome to Geneva.
Thank you, Tim. My deepest apologies, Tim. We made a miscalculation regarding time, and I am so awfully sorry that I am late in this, and I have listened briefly already. And the earlier speakers have hit the nail right on the head on so many issues. One thing that leaps up immediately to me as somebody who is familiar with this terrain and working in this area is essentially we have not confronted in any significant and purposive way the dichotomy between indigenous peoples and local communities in this context. Participating with a lot of indigenous peoples, and myself also being caught at identity level at the intersection of being an indigenous person and a member of the local community. Most of the debates we go into these arguments about what will benefit indigenous peoples and local communities, and you tend to see a lot of reference being made to UNDRIPs, and rightly so. But when it comes to the context of benefit sharing, DSI, and these emerging technologies, you also see that there is a significant part of local communities that are engaged in a very serious way, like Ronnie was saying not long ago. And the question is this, there is a dichotomization. There is some aspects of indigenous peoples that enter into this space, seeking to make it an UNDRIPS discussion. and in so doing, drawing distinctions between them and local communities. And we know so much that the CBD and the environmental regime process have been able to activate the concept of local communities. And some detractors take a literal meaning of local communities, but it's an expression that has got a meaning of its own that is unique to its own self and context. So one is worried, and this is a good opportunity to actually begin to see how far we can reconcile these concepts for a purpose of access and benefit sharing, recognizing the divergences in specific national contexts. There are 476 million indigenous peoples globally who can actually say to us, what is the number of local communities in the context of this debate? And how can we not speak past each other and speak purposely in order to activate the real issues that engage the interests of local communities as well as indigenous peoples? This is a very important aspect of the debate that we seem not to have grappled with. And let me make this other point. A lot has been said about fair and care. And open science has taken a very significant lead in this conversation. And we have seen a lot of attempts to politically prepare the concept of fair and care. And the idea is that everybody speaks with some degree of political correctness. But when people are talking about data sovereignty and other people are talking about open access, we need to have a conversation. Can these two concepts coexist, particularly in the context of DSI and benefit sharing? And if they can coexist, how can they coexist? And this is a wonderful opportunity to begin to see how we could untangle these concepts, reconcile them, and plug them into new framework for practical and pragmatic access and benefit sharing. Again, let me apologize for this, and I hope this will help us get into the next round of the conversation. Thank you so much, team.
Thank you very much, Chidi. You remind me that the key to Japan's growth after World War II was something referred to as just-in-time manufacturing. So now we have just-in-time webinar panelists joining us. So thanks again, Chidi. We moved to a second round for this second panel. And as the panelists are aware, this second round, we were looking for you to provide us with, and I think you've already built the foundation, the springboard to do this, to provide us with some concrete advice. This could be in terms of, process. It could be in terms of models, some kind of action and decisions, resources, financing, even politics. What would you recommend concretely in terms of action, in terms of what's filling gaps, in terms of what's needed next? So this is, I see this as an opportunity for you to influence thinking and next steps internationally. So it's a simple question, but the answers, well, maybe the answers are actually quite simple. So let's begin. It's not according to plan, but in fact, I'm going to start back with Anne, if you would, and then Ronnie, and then finally Chidi. And how much time have we got? So use the allotted time. So that was about another five minutes each. So please go ahead, Anne.
Perfect. Thank you. Start with providing some information about the current DSI production landscape before speaking on actionable next steps, because I think that will be useful for further brainstorming and discussion. To create a planetary database of sustainable reference DSI resources for all known species, it would cost roughly $3,000 million US, or more simply, $26,500 US per species. A sustainable reference DSI resource for a species is one that provides first a complete DNA sequence of the genome of an individual that can act as a reference for the entire species group. The second component of this resource is a complete gene annotation for the genome. The third is an associated set of comprehensive and culturally appropriate metadata. The fourth is the resource must also have a physical sample in a permanent museum collection that is associated to the species the DSI was produced from. And finally, and the last part of these resources are a cryopreserved sample for each species that is to be placed in a biobank. So responsible DSI production in an open environment requires intentionally sustaining relationships across all the actors involved in the DSI production lifecycle, so that we can guarantee that any DSI that becomes part of the publicly available planetary database can be traced back to a physical specimen in a museum and a biobank. Additionally, this approach supports accurate metadata disclosure, which is important so that important provenance and attribution information is maintained across the data ecosystem and value chain spanning from the species collection event right through to the upload of the DSI into public databases. I also want to highlight that this DSI production system is quite a departure from how research involving DSI was typically conducted. For example, just 13% of DSI within the INSTC has spatiotemporal information associated with it. Sadly, just 4% can be linked back to a physical genetics resource. And unfortunately, analyses have indicated that the likelihood of reacquiring this important metadata information after data is deposited declines over time. I do not want to give the impression that these system changes happen overnight, nor is today's system perfect. We are still listening and learning to DSI users and actors, staying abreast of technological advancements and responding accordingly. However, through iterative improvements, we are progressively improving DSI systems to support the transformative change required to create an open but responsible system for DSI access and use. Now I will circle back to the question at hand. How do we make iterative changes to operationalize Indigenous data governance and the care principles in a way that is interoperable with the accepted standards of practice for DSI resource production? When I first started grappling with this question, my immediate reaction was, how can IPLCs possibly govern their data if they simply cannot find it? And is there a way to create a DSI system whereby each species that is sampled within IPLC lands and sequenced could have the option to disclose Indigenous rights and interests? The answer to this question was yes, absolutely. This is very possible through the power of metadata. Within metadata records, space can be created to include traditional knowledge and biocultural labels and notices. These labels and notices are machine and human readable digital tags can be associated with both genetics resources and DSI. As they are extra legal, they can live within open access data repositories. The labels and notices are gaining a lot of traction. There are labels and notices in use on almost 700,000 materials, and they have also been applied to peer-reviewed publications. All in all, the labels are a first step in how one could start to think about operationalizing Indigenous data governance and the care principles. They provide the sustainable disclosure of Indigenous rights and interests across the data ecosystem and support equity throughout the DSI value chain. They provide fair attribution, access, and agency to IPLCs over their data so it can be used for their own community priorities and nation building. They promote open and responsible data access and use by the next generation of data scientists. And finally, they provide a mechanism for transparency and accountability, a step toward developing and building trust with IPLCs. It would be naive to think that this is going to work perfectly on the first try, and so I would recommend the identification of milestones where iterative reflections and adjustments can be made when and if required. I will close my remarks today by simply stating that from a technical DSI standpoint, Indigenous data governance is not a departure from DSI scientific best practices, but rather a part of fully realizing it.
Thank you very much, Anne, for meeting your remit clearly. And just to mention to registrants, to everyone on the webinar, that it is, of course, being recorded. It will be available, and Andreas, who has joined us from the team, will be, I believe, drafting a report at some point, which will be released. So your thoughts, Anne, and others, and of course the chat as well, will not be lost. It will be available to everyone, including those who were not able to join us today. Ronnie, looking to you to provide us with some more concrete advice if you have it, and if you're able to there you are. Please go ahead. Your microphone needs to be on, Ronnie.
Thank you very much. I believe that there is need, especially speaking from the Namibian context, need for supporting indigenous resource development process. There's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of resources that probably needs to be addressed. Also, I think within this indigenous scope, and Namibia being a country with a colonial history, the question about access to land remains a critical aspect, especially for communities, indigenous communities that feel that they have lost ancestral land, and how can we take up those kinds of issues, because the issues around land is not only just a question of land, but it's communities' view that that land represents their indigenous resources. They have got resources there with that land, but because of policies, current policies, etc., they have lost land. How do we engage with the communities? How do we support communities in their claims about not necessarily that they will use or get back that land, that particular piece of land, but that can strengthen their case to be able to access benefits through other methods and through other means. I also believe that there is need to relook at the funding mechanism, the funding vehicles that we are using in supporting local communities and indigenous communities. I believe that it has not been able to reap the benefits that we intend to achieve. So I would like to recommend that we need to move towards a more intentional funding mechanisms that are having clear objectives that should, I think, move away from the conventional approaches. We need new models of funding, and I'm glad about the lessons learned from the indigenous community support and what could work in that particular context. But I also believe that these things are very context specific to be able to see what works in what context. And I think Namibia, with the years of work around CBNRM and also the current funding models that have come in, we have got an opportunity to build a knowledge management depository that would be able to document lessons about what seems to have worked, what is not working, what is it that we can scale up to be able to maximize the benefits from that. But I believe that the funding regime, we support direct access by communities in terms of these resources. But as I have said already, community-based organizations are not necessarily set up to be able to deal with this. Therefore, capacity building needs to be an integral part of such kind of interventions. There has been, I think, overemphasis on investing into things, but I think a future paradigm should be investing into skills, investing into capacity, people's development efforts, because if we invest into only things, and the emphasis needs to shift, and we need to find the right balance. I'm not implying that we don't need things, but it doesn't have help to invest into a poultry project. It doesn't invest into a hydroponic garden project if communities do not have the capacity, if they don't have the business knowledge to be able to run that project. What I mean with the funding regime needs to be looked at and changed. We normally structure these things around a 3-year funding model. But if we want to really talk about ecosystem restoration support, these by nature are very much long-term investments and long-term support if you want to see benefits for that. So we need to have more flexible funding mechanisms that takes into account those different levels of development and capacity building and be able to see that we need to support communities in a long run. I mean, for example, my take has been that in many times communities are supported for a 3-year development project. But the time that money or that resource really comes to communities, because of all the bureaucracies and all the processes that needs to be done, normally this happens or comes to the communities in the last 12 months, where communities are now squeezed into a situation where procurement has to be done rapidly, the project has to be implemented, and many of the support that has been provided only ends when the project ends. But I think we need to add another layer to be able to say, how do we support communities beyond that funding to be able to implement that business or income generating initiative, to be able to successfully implement? For example, although I have talked about the UNDP small grants as one of the support models, indigenous communities were supported to have a garden project. They were able to produce during the time of those 12 months, and we were seeing quite a successful. Even private sector has offered to buy the fruits from that community, but because there was lack of capacity for them to be able to develop their products and marketing and ensuring success around that project today is almost close to becoming a white elephant. Therefore, I believe a funding mechanism needs to be relooked at if we want to maximize benefits for our local communities, because I don't think that the current funding model, in the way that it's been implemented, benefits the communities. Yes, we are supporting direct access by community-based organizations, but that needs to be supported with capacity building efforts, and some of these aspects that I've mentioned needs to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronnie. Again, very, very concrete and very clear suggestions, ways forward. Chidi, over to you.
Thank you, team, and thank you for the last speaker. So I wanted to put something on the table. If you look at the international treaty WHO model of access and benefit sharing and the multilateral framework, the language has always been to build capacity in developing countries, countries with economies in transition, and small island countries. And this is consistent with the pattern of development support provided by Western countries to developing countries. But in the context of DSI and access and benefit sharing, we cannot overemphasize the space which indigenous peoples and local communities occupy directly. And it's not a model of development support that is required here. So, and we know also that a lot of effort has been put into the concept of capacity building and capacity development, and is robustly present in all the documents and the build up to this conversation. But I wanted to suggest that capacity building that focuses on governance models on indigenous peoples and local communities. This is what I mean. And oftentimes you see developing countries supporting, developed countries supporting African countries to build democratic institutions and all that stuff. Now, have we ever wondered how can we support governance capacities in indigenous peoples and local communities? And this is very important, to put investment, quote and unquote, dollar into helping indigenous peoples and local communities communicate to us their governance capacity or governance expectations, to help them build capacity in governance. Because nowadays, all the protocols and cultural practices that they are engaged in is now being drawn into the global space to necessarily engage with these new frameworks we are building. Are we building capacity for governance? Are we helping indigenous peoples and local communities communicate to us their governance models and help to scrutinize how that governance model can feed into these new frameworks for DSI and access and benefit sharing that we're talking about? So, and this gets into the next point I'm going to make. How can we ensure the transformation of emerging concepts in indigenous knowledge frameworks? And at the foundation of the conversation around DSI, we've always talked about the tendency to say, oh, this is a scientist conversation. And the original framing of what DSI was is the traditional knowledge was on the periphery of that conversation. And some experts have disagreed whether that was right or wrong. But the point here is that if we cared enough to invest in the concept of transformation of emerging concepts in indigenous knowledge frameworks, then we should be able to have an informed conversation about that. And the third point is then, how can we be modeling available governance regimes to adjust to the new expectations we are now imposing upon indigenous peoples to participate in new and strange spaces. So we should also, we talked a lot about data, and it's very right to do so. And do we have data of governance models and how successful they have been? Okay, we are talking about local entities being called up under global pressure to participate in strange spaces. And we should be able to be intentional or deliberate about facilitating that capacity. And we should, and the fourth point, we should be able to create awareness of how indigenous peoples and local communities can participate in the new technological spaces without necessarily being framed as providers, but also as users and multiple sectoral actors. Okay, if you look at all this talking about DSI and so on, it is still the old framework that they are providers. Oh, it is the data about them, whether we transform it into virtual or digital or scientific expressions. But do they have capacity also to participate in this place as co-knowledge creators? And this is important to the extent that it goes into this intentional capacity building for governance so that indigenous peoples can participate in these spaces as informed and equal partners, supported incredibly and intentionally to do so. And we can also look at partnership models and existing protocols. And DSI conversation did not come into this space by accident. It was a buildup of so many technological developments, international designs and regimes that now cross across multiple sites. So what has been the partnership models and existing protocols that indigenous peoples and local communities have used? And how can we adapt or adjust them to DSI in the context of genetic resources? And this is just an important thing to really talk about. And the penultimate point I need to make here is this. The issue of monetization of DSI. And I was looking at the chart and Pierre took it from me. Monetization of DSI is really a culturally sensitive conversation that should be had. And indigenous peoples and local communities must be able to participate in that space. And in order for them to make informed participation, we should be intentional, like I said earlier, to draw the transformation of emerging concepts and see how we can put it into the indigenous framework. And this is not an imposition. It is hearing from them. This is what scientists are saying. This is how they have broken matters into their highest molecular components, where we have dispensed with physical access. And now we're talking about benefit sharing without necessarily the familiarity of physical access. And then we are talking about monetization. Are they going to participate in this space in a culturally appropriate manner? If so, what is the governance capacity they bring to the table in order to equitably participate in this space? And finally, the issue of monetary and non-monetary benefits. This has come over and over again in the Nagoya Protocol regime. But this is a wonderful opportunity to really rethink and take a stock of what has already happened in the Nagoya space. What could possibly happen in the DSI space? And how could we even learn from that? So finally, to conclude this, a lot has been said about capacity building, capacity development. Can we think about building capacity and developing capacity around governance to effectively equip and enable indigenous peoples participate and find out how they respond and how their knowledge frameworks respond to these new concepts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chidi, and thanks again to all of you, and Ronnie, for some really very concrete thoughts and suggestions. There's so much to chew on. I am going to do something that was not planned, and I'm going to give an opportunity just with a few minutes before we go to Suel and Andreas, who've been monitoring the chat as everyone else has been monitoring, to the first set of panelists for 1 minute reactions from either Paul, Terence, or Pierre on what you've heard or what you've learned from our second set of panelists. So it's up to you to who goes first. I could put you on the spot, but I'm going to give it to Paul because his microphone is the first one to go on. Paul, please, 1 minute.
Jump in there. Yeah, I've got two responses, and thanks very much to Chidi for those last comments with which I very much agreed. I think we need to hear a lot more from indigenous researchers and scientists and those involved in genomics research and their collaborators. Yeah, this is, as Anna's highlighted, actually, this is not new. Indigenous nations in North America, in Canada and elsewhere have been involved in the governance of genomics for many years, and we need to hear more about this experience and these initiatives rather than this kind of abstract genomics from on high, as it were, which I think we hear far too much about in the kind of abstract, as it were. My second comment was really relating to the kind of direct funding issues. Now, one of the big concerns that the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity expressed at COP15 and in its subsequent submission on digital sequence information was about the issue of direct funding for Indigenous peoples from developed countries, which has come up in the chat. And one of the concerns there about the GEF is that a GEF-focused mechanism would preclude the possibility at present of Indigenous peoples in developed countries receiving direct finance. So I'm grateful to Terence for mentioning that there will be meetings in August in Canada, where there will be some discussions, but I think it would be fair to say that some way forward needs to be found on that issue. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Terence, did you wade in here, or yes, go ahead.
Yeah, just to echo the comment around the co-creation of knowledge in terms of Western science and indigenous knowledge. Indeed, indigenous knowledge has often revealed what Western taxonomists have not been able to see in terms of the differences between species. But speaking to Chidi's point around governance, the investment of capacity building also in terms of international institutions to understand indigenous governance systems is part of that process. And yeah, we in the Jeff Small grants we've invested heavily in terms of territorial governance mechanisms, in terms of some of the Aichi targets, and we'll continue to focus on that under the GBF. And then just finally, the point that Ronnie was making about long-term mechanisms is absolutely critical, that the grants that last for 2 or 3 years and then disappear versus a long-term trusted working relationship based on reciprocal relations is really where we would like to be. Over, thanks.
Thank you very much, Terence. Yeah, the term that's increasingly used here in Canada, where I join you from, is braiding knowledge, the concept of interweaving of various approaches to knowledge. Pierre, please.
Yes, I have comments along exactly the same line, right? I mean, a very big part of the problem that we have today is the result of colonialism, of a dominator culture that, violently took over people's lands, disrupted the relationship between people and nature, turned that into, a system of virtue which undermined indigenous knowledge actively undermined by stealing children from their parents and putting them into institutions. And you know, a very big part of the solution, to my mind, is to go back and integrate those like relational, respectful, networked relationships that indigenous people still have with nature, and bring that wisdom back to the rest of the world, and actually make that part of the multilateral approach to how you run a planet sustainably. And in doing that, of course, we need to address all of the issues that the other panelists have mentioned, right? Like capacity development, like culturally appropriate dialogues, like respect for the people who still hold that knowledge, and in many cases also take care of the biodiversity. But I think that it's important that there's an outbreak of humility in the Western worldview that says, like, look, we got a lot of things right when it comes to science, but we're not getting it right when it comes to environmental management. Here are people who are still looking after 80% of the biodiversity we have left. What do they know that we don't know? How do we integrate that into our global management plans? How do we all become indigenous in a sense? Because in a way, of course, we are all indigenous to Earth, and we only have one planet. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And again, thanks to Paul and Terence as well. We'll now move to Suel and Andreas, who've been monitoring the chat, as I mentioned, and I'm sure there are a few gems that we could bring to the panelists for some reaction or for some answers. So please, Suel.
Yes, thanks, Tim. Thanks to panelists and also those that contributed to the chat. I mean, it's a little bit like revisiting what has already been mentioned by some of the panelists. I mean, there were basically three elements in a chat which was not that agile as usually, but apparently people are trying to get their heads around about the different questions in particular that Pierre has raised. But so one is, again, this question on the eligibility of indigenous peoples and local communities that are not in developing countries, but rather in developed countries. They do have, of course, also the advantage in stewardship and so on. So is and can there be an eligibility of receiving funds within or outside of the GEF? We heard that there are some first discussions in that regard, but maybe from the panelists, what are the feelings in that regard? Is the GEF the only solution, and what could be possible pathways?
Thanks, Suel. I'll open the floor to whoever wants to respond, but note that for everyone's benefit that our panelists are speaking on their own behalf, from their own expertise, and not from the institutions that they're currently associated with. So we do have a little bit of freedom and a little more license than sometimes. Does anyone want to respond? Any suggestions? Any comments on that?
Could also be Preston, of course.
Absolutely, it could be Preston.
Well, yes, of course. You know, it's a misunderstanding that the tribes and First Nations and indigenous peoples of North America are rich and wealthy and can afford all of the things they need. It's not really true. And getting tribal hard dollars to do this research and these kinds of initiatives is very difficult oftentimes. They're actually as it used to be said, the third world in the first. They have their own development issues. This also goes back to the need for capacity building, both on data governance and on the operation of the global mechanism, that there's some very large challenges in capacity building.
Yes, so well put, Paul.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, this is quite a big discussion, but I think there are actually different ways of imagining the constitution of a global multilateral benefit sharing mechanism. or a global fund than imagining what I've previously called a giant fund in the sky, which tends to be the first thing that people seem to reach for. One could imagine the constitution of a mechanism or global fund being nationally or regionally focused in nature, where monies are, however they might be derived, are collected nationally and made nationally available in accordance with agreed priorities, where in that case indigenous peoples and local communities in all participating countries would gain direct access through that route rather than through some giant remote fund somewhere or other. So, but that's a much bigger discussion, of course. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Suel, should we go back? Have you got one more? Or we
yeah, but I mean, it's probably also about a bigger discussion. And what has been raised by several panelists has been echoed then also in the chat. It's the question on how to build this trust, which then could lead to efficiency and equity. And is this then only, let's say, through good examples, proof of principle, through benefit sharing, or what are ways actually to get into a more collaborative and trustworthy mode? And I think we can have very short answers only on that. It would basically deserve a known webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. But can we do one answers? Yeah. So I certainly have answers, but that's not for me to respond. Yeah. Chidi, please.
Thanks, Tim. One of the major heavy lifting that needs to be done, I suspect previous panelists have spoken about this, is how to design a functional and dynamic formula for benefiting from this Paul's giant fund in the sky. And this is really creating what I could consider to be a changing framework over time as science and knowledge changes. We talk about the melting Arctic and the Inuit and the hidden treasures in this new ecosystem, and how knowledge is also interspersed with some of these changes in ecology. And therefore, we cannot, for instance, say that a specific benefit goes to a specific indigenous peoples and local communities, while in the next 5 years, the whole ecological dynamic changes completely. So we should be able to be designing a formula for benefit sharing based on existing dynamics, based on regions, based on sustainability, and taking into consideration so many actors, those more directly engaged, those who are not directly engaged, but who are relevant in the evolution of knowledge systems. So there are many designs in the UN model where you can, for instance, using the WHO model, where you can divide the whole world into regions in specific contexts and begin to really design a framework for tapping into this fund, or for designing the benefits that actors will benefit from. Now, there is no gainsaying that there will be targeted benefit sharing. There will be those that are not directly involved, but they are actually part of the ecosystem for sustainability of the knowledge systems. But more importantly to me is to have a design that will continuously be revisited periodically, because knowledge evolves, ecosystems change, and people develop new insights and ideas. And so this is a foundational stage where we'll ask critical questions and be able to design. Thank you.
Thank you, Chidi, and sorry to cut you off. I know, Pierre, you're in the queue. We've just gone over time. If you've can do it in 30 seconds, that would be terrific, please. And then we're going to Preston very, very briefly, and then we're going to close. Go ahead, Pierre.
Yeah, I mean, my very quick soundbite here is like, please, let's start sharing some benefits so that people can see the logic of the CBD in action. Without the flow of benefits, we're not going to get sustainable use and conservation, no matter how much money we throw at that.
Thank you, Pierre. Suel, over to you, and then to Preston.
No, I think that's fine now. I think we can hand over to Preston for his final remarks on what he pulled out of this webinar.
Well, I think, of course, relationality is at the core of everything. And that's what we need to build, is a kind of build-in relationality into our future work. I think the panelists have said it very well. Without participation, without full and effective participation, Pierre raised the question of whether it's going to be observation or actual participation in governance. We really need to build that trust, is to engage Indigenous peoples and local communities throughout, and focus on the processes that we need and the experimentation we need to build this over time.
Thank you, Preston. And with that, I will turn my camera off and we will move to the conclusion of the webinar. And thanks again to all the panelists.
Yes, thanks a lot. We will indeed now close, and sorry for having run a little bit over time. However, it hasn't been discussed in an exhaustive manner now. We hope that with the reflections by the panelists and also from the floor, we could contribute to some further thinking and guidance to the formal process. We will put the records in the 3 languages online in due time. Probably as so many issues have been raised, the written report may take a little bit longer, but as we are anyway slipping into summer break, it's probably not that urgent, but we'll try to set that up also within the next 2 weeks. Thanks a lot to the panelists of the 2 rounds. Thanks a lot to Preston, to the moderator, to you, Tim, to all the staff, to the interpreters, which are doing a real great job. And we would be pleased if you, when now leaving the webinar, could help us improving our work and just fill in this short evaluation. And yeah, you will hear from us with further webinars on the topic of DSI. We do have a couple of ideas on pertinent issues that might be helpful to be reflected prior to the next working group meeting, but that will be then rather after the summer break. So thanks a lot.